This is The Naked Life with Roxanne Noor. Today, I'm interviewing Jade Richardson. Jade has been an investigative journalist and a writer for the past 20 years. She was featured in the Sydney Morning Herald, Australian Penthouse, Italian Vogue, the Telegraph, and many other media outlets. She also has 30 years of experience studying Jungian psychology and has interwoven her knowledge from the Western Front with wisdom from indigenous tribes. Having grown up in Africa and then living in the Amazon, she has a plethora of knowledge on indigenous wisdom and the spatial connection we all need to root into the land, to connect with Gaia. Today, we're going to be talking about how we can communicate with our soul when the soul speaks, how to live a life in accordance with the soul, and interweave the concept of the self and the shadow from a Jungian perspective. We hope that our discussion gives you tools for connecting to yourself from a deeper place of knowledge and authenticity, and that we can allow ourselves to widen perspectives away from our indoctrination of the culture and return to a place of inner truth and knowing. Here's Jade.
So Jung was one of the first Western thinkers to come into the field of psychology and start to look at these ancient ideas of soul. Okay, so he brought soul in. The question of, wait a minute, I think that what's the problem here is actually the soul. How do we talk about soul? What is soul? I mean, this is at a time in the world where we didn't even believe we had a soul, right? The soul had been kind of thrown out the window on the way to material success.
Or it was just predominantly spoken of only in terms of religion. So the only times the soul was expressed, it wasn't through this lens of understanding the self or psychoanalysis, but it was really through just religious contextual things.
That's true. And so Christianity had kind of possessed the literacy.
Yes.
Well, actually what it had done is it had destroyed the entire encyclopedia of understanding the soul that was intact from the history of the world, right, by destroying the Celts and the Saxons and the Indians and everybody they could get hold of, and then claimed that piece of real estate and also became brokers. You know, so we were estranged from our soul. We had to go via an institution.
And there's a middleman who can connect you. It's not something that's within yourself, actually.
Exactly. And that there's behaviors that are required, and that there's all these strange Latin songs, and, you know, you're outsourced from your soul. And that's not healthy, right? Okay, we agreed to it. I think it was done, you know, across the planet. It was done, this vivisection, the separation of the soul from the individual and from the culture and from the land, right? And then re-administered back to us, just like we do with food, you know, and we do it with we do it with everything. We commodify, right, these major life libidos. And that was kind of like a path of hell that we've been on since we industrialized, right? That you could commodify the water, you could commodify your home, right? You could commodify anything. And that would be at a point when human beings would have mastery over the unpredictability of the world, right? That was the kind of promise. And riches and freedom from suffering and toil. But we've ended up kind of realizing that this is a little bit of a sour harvest. Okay, what's the indicators for that? Loneliness, anorexia, drug abuse, addiction of all kinds, the interface of tech, that's kind of vampired inside of people's imaginariums, the breakdowns of marriage, childhood suicide, medication of children, which is escalating at, alarming rates. I mean, I don't mean like 50%, I mean like 400% increases in short periods of time of having to medicate young children. Okay, these are described as indicators of chemical breakdown, in the body. I'm giggling a little bit because it's so absurd, right? That we've managed to come up with a whole series of hoaxes to explain why we're suffering, right? From the indigenous point of view, it's very simple. We're suffering because you can't get away with breaking down the soul without breaking down all the other systems. And you cannot buy your way back into a soulful life. And it's not even a fashionable thing to do. It's a primary thing to do for a human animal. So depth psychology has been dabbling in those waters, and I'm very interested in that because I felt it myself. And later on in my life, I became an investigative journalist, and I started to look at crime and corruption. And everywhere I went, I could see this is a question of soul. This is a question of the disturbance of the soul of the perpetrators and the feasting on the soul of the victims. Okay, so journalism became a little bit like kind of passé in the end, because it was, where do you stop? Where do you stop finding things to be horrified about? You know, like, it never ends. So there's no way to finish this. It's like in serving in that job was almost like a never-ending series of plugging tiny little holes while the dam wall was breaking, because it seemed to me that actually the soul of the world was in great peril at that time, which was a couple of decades ago now. So then I became more interested in looking at the soul. Well, who knows about the soul? Well, I can tell you it's not going to be modern people coming up with formulas and sexy book titles, right? That's like the person who doesn't know coming up with formulas to make a profit on the anxiety of having lost contact with your soul.
And even in what we see with kind of this self-help culture, I think, is a calling back to the fact that people know something huge on a spiritual dimension is missing, and trying to come into communication in ways in which the logical mind can comprehend it. So as you said, like how to, or things that are measurable, and that's not exactly the way it works. So from what you've seen in Jungian psychoanalysis and in indigenous cultures, how would you describe the soul, and what do you think fractures us from this communication and this connection?
Well, I guess looking at, so I spent a lot of time in the Amazon. So this is very chic now. It wasn't very chic then.
Yeah.
Okay.
This was how long ago for you?
The first time I went there, I was about 20. So it was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I was in the Amazon before people were in the Amazon.
Yes.
I mean, there was obviously people there, but it wasn't fashionable to go there, and it wasn't easy, and it wasn't particularly comfortable to be there at that time. And I don't even know what it was that compelled me to go. I just felt that my life course was being provided by circumstances at that time, and I followed them. There was no Wi-Fi, there was no GPS, there was no podcasts, there was no temples of ayahuasca or anything, right?
Yeah.
It was like rat-eaten buses and mouldy old cabins here and there, and people who were in extreme jeopardy being poisoned by mercury miners and all the rest of it. That is what the Amazon has become, and even more so now, actually.
So somehow you followed these omens, these signs to go, and then...
Yeah, I had like a couple of serious illnesses, like very serious, and that were like heading towards medicalization and all the rest of it, and I would have to rest and restore, and then I would have like an epiphany moment, and that would be like, go to the Amazon or go to Sulawesi in Indonesia, and then I would go on long treks, like very long treks, and walk those countries, but without any particularly kind of philosophical reason to do it. I just felt that was the only thing left to do. So I basically, they were like, in a sense, the real version of a pilgrimage, right? It's very innocent. And I pack up my little backpack and head off, and didn't have a book contract or anything, to justify it, which is kind of beautiful considering what's become of it now.
Yes.
My friends who go to the Amazon now, they're not going there innocently. They're going there to build their shaman status, right?
And this thing of we have preconceived notions of what we think it is, whereas you're talking about this time where there really is this thing of the unknown. That's a sense.
Right. And you talk about the mystery, and why do we want to approach the mystery, and what can we get from the mystery? And increasingly the mystery is under great peril everywhere, because really we don't really want to go to the mystery. We want to get something out of it. Okay, that's not the right approach to a mystery. A mystery is not I'll go and do something a little bit kooky, but what I want out of it is more status and more commercial merit, right? I've got to do the Amazon trip because it will get me into the shaman status so that I can make some money. This is disastrous. it is so out of integrity in every possible way, and we've really moved into that territory like writ large now. But at the time I went, no, it was very different for me, and I'm kind of proud to say that now, although at the time I was innocent. And I've never turned my Amazon stuff into any kind of business. And I've been extremely diligent about keeping the faith of the people that I met there and the things that I learned there, to the point that I hardly even wrote about it journalistically at the time. But what happened there was I met people whose soul was so plugged into the landscape, right, that there was almost no persona. Right, the clothing, the housing, the furniture, the stuff. There was no real interface. You didn't meet a persona.
And even the word persona comes from the Latin term of mask.
Yeah.
There's no need probably for mask, and this is something that I've also seen with people who are really connected to the land. Is this thing, and there's not so much difference between the internal environment and the external. And you see this with people who, actually I have one friend who's a Native American and he lives up in Canada, and he tells me all the time, part of the reason why people's souls are suffering is because there is no spatial connection anymore. We don't have a connection to our roots. We've lost the connection to our land, which is therefore a connection actually to ourselves and from where we were birthed. And I think I've even felt this in myself. My parents are immigrants that came from India to America. And for me, it was living between both worlds. Like in America, I'm an Indian. And in India, I'm a Yankee, basically. And this thing of not knowing, this thing of not knowing how to connect.
Yeah.
And so when you were in the Amazon, did you feel like, from people who you saw when you say this fractured soul versus these people who are just in their bodies, in connection to the land? And to me, actually, the soul always communicates through the body. For me, we were given bodies for a reason. And when the soul comes through, there is this ability to hold light. Mm-hmm. And the body has an enormous capability to hold light. And when we are in tune with our environments, when emotionally, physically, and mentally there is a union, then I think soul has more leverage to speak. Mm. And this is what I've seen. And in the people who I feel that they are most connected to their souls, where they're not being tossed back and forth by their environments, but there's something steady and almost ancient and primordial in them, is this connection between emotional, physical, and mental body in which the soul can speak. And having this understanding of the land, tending to your own garden, knowing, where you come from, your roots, living in small communities, gives more room.
Well, I think that's where we're trying to work it out at the moment, isn't it? Like I think what's happening on Earth at the moment, or at least in the modern cultures, I'll talk for them or for us because I'm part of that, and so are you, and we're part of that, living here. We're desperately trying to work out, okay, how do we move so far away from subsistence living, poverty, material impoverishment or material simplicity? How do we get all this complexity and maintain a sacred spiritual life? That's the big question, isn't it? Right? That's what we're doing. We're trying to mix the paradoxes. And I think that is what we're destined to do. I think that's the big experiment. The big spiritual experiment is, can we become conscious? Can we develop the Midas touch, turn all of the material world into gold, into wealth, and maintain a relationship to soul and to something beyond materialism? We're trying to mix that up. And that's what everybody's making $1 out of in this scene, right? So you're going to be a vegan, or you're going to be only eating meat, or you're going to do breath work, or you're an ice bather, or whatever. Like, all of these things are technologies that we're all racing to build a brand on, right? Saying, I can help you become extremely powerful and manifesting everything you dream of and keeping your soul intact. Right? So that's the invitation. So, and that invitation was foreseen a long time ago by these amazing psychologists, right? And I think some of the authors, I'm looking on the bookshelves, I see Huxley and I see Carlos Castaneda and I see, I think there was, Anais Nin is there. She talked about it through the erotic, and there's other authors. They all warned we're heading in this direction. And it's catastrophic direction. Like to go so far away from simplicity and humble belongingness. Like we're traveling to the edge of the psychological cosmos, and we want to become gods, but can we remain human at the same time, right? Like how do we do it? So the Amazonian guys were never interested in that because they were already there. Okay, they were already there. They had an incredible, like if you turned up at that time, you were obviously brought there by the soul of the world, right? There's no other reason to come. Like if you were either an intruder from the military, which I obviously wasn't, right? Or you were brought there by the soul of the world. So you were received with a kind of etiquette, a high level of hospitality, of like a welcome to the human, welcome to this humanness, welcome to this sacred country. But there's no arrogance about it. It was a high etiquette with no hierarchy on it, let's say, until you entered ceremonial space. That's when the personas were put on. Okay, that's when people put on masks.
And it was to hold the energetics of the room. What was it?
Oh, it was because you were entering the sacred space. This is dangerous territory now, right? Like the ordinary life had its own perils, but the theater of crossing over into encounters with the sacred is much more dangerous in an indigenous setting, right? Because they know that the gods are not only helpful, right? They know that the gods are not only kind. Whereas we've completely thrown that one out the window, right? We're doing, ayahuasca, no worries. Like, it's really not like that. You're really inviting yourself to walk into the pantheon of the most wicked and dangerous, as well as the most benevolent and wise. And so you would require a cover, some kind of a cover when you enter that space. That's why in temples in the Amazon, they're in the dark. They're going to frighten the hell out of you deliberately, right, in order to create enough of a break in your ordinary way of being that there can be a split so that forces higher than you can turn up, and not just for your entertainment, right, which is kind of, I think, where we've got to in the scene, right? It's entertaining. It's like...
And it's just such a byproduct of the culture, which is because there's this atrophy from soul that we're just seeking whatever pleasures that we can take. And pleasure is a completely different feeling than actual bliss. And I think a lot of the time we don't know how to reach these ecstatic states. So then we're just reaching towards whatever will bring us the most, like kind of like a joyride. And it's like you said, like it's a lot of people who are now doing ayahuasca, it's not having a clear intention. It's a lack of care. It's more of just doing something for the experience itself. And that is a kind of hedonic way to live.
There's so many things that can be said, but it's also entered into the therapeutic space, right? And it's entered into the kind of tech space too, right? It's cool to do it. And also, like when I went home, my 72-year-old mother and her friends were talking about psilocybin. Like maybe that's a good idea. And I'm like, what's happening? Okay, so it's really turned up in the middle. Yeah. Why? And this is where I would go back to, because we are in the middle of an extremely dangerous and important experiment across the planet, and that is, can we depart from the belongingness of the soul? Like, can we be born basically out of the world as it was, and then have a conscious awakening, and then re-stitch ourselves back into the soul of the world, having had a conscious awakening? Right? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
And so we're all on that flight. Like, there's no way around it now, because it's infected everything. It's infected people's faith in the media, their faith in government, their faith in money, their faith in food, water, housing, everything. Like, faith is under extreme stress. So people are now looking for ways back to feeling that it's good and safe and true and meaningful to be on the world. Okay? And that's a marketplace now. It never was a marketplace when the indigenous used these modalities to replenish and restore the soul of the tribe and the soul of the land, which were connected. Mm-hmm. that was not considered a marketplace. That was considered a normal part of living a human life. Okay, these rights, partly because they burn off the accumulated stresses and revenges and resentments and vanities that are a normal part of human life too, or let's say the curse of the hunt and the injuries accumulated in ordinary life. We have to burn that off in a human life, and ceremony was part of burning it off, at the same time as it was part of like igniting new energy, new vision, new insight, right, inside the tribe. But now it's not like that, right? Now we're going and shopping. We're shopping for help, okay? And so that's psychoanalysis or depth psychology, which is where I am now, writing and art and imagination, dream analysis you spoke of, and accessing ecstatic states through ice baths and breath work and all the rest of it are all in the same category, I think. They're all attempts to re-soul the experience of being on the planet at this time. Now, the problem is, I think, people only want to re-soul so that they can up-level their game.
To be more productive, and this is exactly going back to what you said about Silicon Valley people, where the loop is let me heal so then I can be productive again, let me face my burnout so then I can be more productive. But I think even from living on this island, and we have access to some really fascinating, beautiful people who are playing in the material world, who are super successful, but are going back to actually what matters most to me is loving life and coming into a state of being with Eros again and being with what it means to be human, which is our interdependency in other people. And I think there's changes. What we're seeing is a lot of different countercultures emerging post-COVID, actually. And because of this distrust that people have had escalated because of COVID through, failures of institutions, there is more of a reliance now on self. There has been so much outsourcing of power always. And I think particularly with this island we live on is this reclaiming the self and basically, reclaiming the soul through these various modalities that you speak of. I think the scary part is when we are using something beautiful and then trying to, if it's this feeling that once anything gets too big, it basically gets ruined in a way or minimized, or the actual thing that made it so beautiful becomes kind of corroded. And I think that's what we're seeing with a lot of spiritual practices is this diminishment of them through a lack of humility, of people thinking they're experts and just teaching things that are bullshit, or this thing of predatory capitalistic systems encroaching in and how much money can I make doing this.
Well, that's right. I totally agree. And look at the yoga scene. I mean, what a disaster. I mean, take something that was like a high art, an exquisite set of wisdoms, right? That, it belonged to it was the sort of old growth forest of thousands of years of meticulous research into the human being and the cosmos, right? And now you can learn to deliver that in, just a few days, basically, from the trickle down, from the masters through to the girl who just learned it 30 days ago is now initiating you. This is just a disaster. And look, and it has, it has its benefits, right, to a degree, but I think it's a really good warning system, right? It's yoga. What happened to yoga is, in one way, it's beautiful. It was thrown out as one of the life rafts, and then it got kind of mass produced in China, right? And then you got thousands of life rafts that you could order for a very cheap price, but they're not robust enough to actually get you across the turbulent straits of the dire situation that we're in across the world. They're not enough. It's not enough. That's why we have to now have ice baths and yoga, veganism and yoga. It's got to be added on, right?
But it's also the way we package and sell things. So, for example, when you learn about the 8 limbs of yoga and things that actually make sense on it's not just a physical practice, it's really a mental discipline and this fine tuning of the soul, and the way it was packaged to the West as a form of fitness, just like physical fitness, basically. And the way we lose the essence of things based on who we're trying to sell something to. And this was a huge thing with, for example, Bikram yoga, and that took place in LA, of him going to these women who just want to be hot, basically, and things becoming trendy for really vapid ideals.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you know, that was the American problem, wasn't it? You know, the American experiment kind of affected everybody, right? America was so beautiful in a way. It was like the child of the modern world. It was born out of the modern world, you know, the savior of the Superman of the world. America wanted to be, or kind of was set up to be, the superhero of the planet. And then it became intoxicated with its own self. Like, it had a narcissistic crisis, which kind of then contaminated the entire world as well, right?
Yeah, it's interesting to think of nations as like beings, and America to me is really this, like, when you're a fumbling teenager and you think you're invincible and, oh, I can do everything, and then you're kind of just America putting their fingers in everything. And because the entertainment industry is so huge, when we even think about things like globalization, it's not really globalization, it's the pushing out of Western idealism, and how so much of America is super interesting as this like fumbling teenager. And then you look at a country like Great Britain, and it's kind of like this elder that's trying to relax. Not, I mean, after Brexit, weird situation, but yeah, of thinking of
I think yeah, I mean, that could say a lot about America. I think America was set up to be that. I don't think that's actually how it evolved naturally. I think it was a deliberate construct. I think that Americans are, and I don't know, I would discuss this with somebody more educated in it than me. It would be interesting, but I think America is fascinating because there's no way that America came out of such a short history and developed itself as such a powerful nation without interference.
Yeah.
Okay?
The dominance had to be there.
Well, it's like a proxy state, just like what's happening in Ukraine. It was used as a proxy for other powers. And they became militarized and, you know, saving the world type iconology as a proxy to outsource that energy from other more powerful states. It just seems obvious.
And then getting into our initial discussion actually about the way we see the shadow, and then the way we see the shadow in terms of the self and the nations. Can you speak to that? Because I feel like there's also, in spiritual communities like this one that we're living in, there's a lot of misinformation about the shadow, or like, oh, let me do shadow work by punching this pillow and talking about how much I hated my parents, or this what actually is the shadow? How can we come into contact with the shadow if it is something that is repressed and hidden in the unconscious?
Well, let's say that, let's go back to this idea that we're on that the ecosystem of the soul designing its own awakening. Okay, let's just imagine that what's happening in the world is that, all right, that everything makes sense, that what's happening at the moment is like birth, right? It's uncomfortable. You're in a little dream bubble inside, you've got the sounds, it's all jazzy and funky, and then something starts going wrong, right? Like, it's getting squeezy, you know, you're getting contractions, there's chemistry moving, you get turned around, you're going to see a light, you know, oh my God, you know, and then you're going to get born. And let's just imagine that that's actually maybe what's happening on the planet, that things are getting a bit uncomfortable in order to create a birth, right? Not necessarily a death, although, you know, you could potentially say that's something coming too. We have to work it out. We have to work out really for each of ourselves, are we facing an epiphany, a wake up, which is what people want to say. I hear that all the time. And I hear it from people who've got no idea what they're talking about, mostly, actually, because waking up's not fun at all, right? And it's also kind of like an arrogant thing, you know, like, I'm awake. And that's why the woke community is carrying such a burden, right? Because the grown-ups are going, you've got no clue what you're on about. You've been put in the disreputable basket. And this is what, go back to the Amazon, these guys knew that. That's why they didn't put on much persona, right? That's why there's not a kind of like a whole lot of arrogance and much narcissism in those tribes that I was involved with at the time. That they weren't like that. They were walking around in gum boots, Wellington boots, and, you know, scrappy old bits of football shorts, and God only knows, you know, it wasn't glamorous, okay? because there was no, you don't induct that stuff in those environments. That's dangerous to induct that stuff, right? It causes disturbance in the community. They value harmony higher than the individual's pursuit of glamour or influence. And to be the shaman is not necessarily a credit. That is a burden, right? And that's what we've lost, right? We are so intoxicated with being important in the West. We are so intoxicated with status and power and hierarchy and influence and the mirror, right? This is the ultimate disaster, to be infatuated with the mirror, okay? Because it means that you lose perspective of the whole 360-degree, multi-dimensional experience of being here, because you've become engaged with a flat surface. And then you're starting to engineer reality, and we're very susceptible to that engineering. We're a very delicate animal, highly influenceable, highly breakable, right? So these tribes that I met, or people I met in Africa, in India, when I was in Zimbabwe, it was like that. When I was in Indonesia, it was like that. It was beautiful, actually, because people were more on a kind of, you're human, I'm human, there's human goodness here, right? That's not what's the world that we're in anymore. Now we're in a, check out my yoga body, check out my Facebook profile, check out my Instagram, check out all the reasons why I can attract you, because you want to be like me, or you want to have a piece of me. This temptation stuff that we're doing, we're coming closer and closer to a place where that's actually affecting all of the currency of involvement, right, with each other. What's that creating? Depression, anxiety, school shootings, lack of faith, lack of God, lack of belonging, all kinds of poisonous things, but we keep going. Right? We keep going, how can I make my life more meaningful? I can make you want to be more like me. I can make you want to buy into my pyramid scheme that I'm running, which is my actual reality, is a pyramid scheme, right? This is horrendous, but we can't help it. We're keeping on going and keeping on going, because it's a Darwinian survival of the fittest thing, right? If I don't keep building my Instagram profile and keep my body more and more desirable, I go down the pyramid, and that makes me more vulnerable. Right? And so this is horrific, right? And this is kind of like the end of culture, right? But it's also potentially like a flight through a crack, like the Star Wars idea, or all the great myths say that when everything goes wrong, when the thing is the worst, when everything is the worst, that's when the most beautiful thing can happen. Right?
Yeah.
That you fly through a crack in reality, that you fly through synchronicities, that amazing, strange, odd things will happen. And the most unlikely individuals will go back and bring treasure back to the culture, right? So we all want to be that one too, right? Oh, I've come up with, 10 ways to hack, wealth, 10 ways to hack health, all this shit. It's absolute crap, right?
Well, also because we're living in the information age, and anyone can... What's beautiful about it is that there's a plethora of ways that people can interact with self-knowledge. The fact that Google is a thing is beautiful. The fact that it's censored, not so beautiful. But going into a larger scheme of things, it seemed like even 50 years ago, there was a huge thing of knowledge being from an expert, or there were people that existed like Nietzsche or James Joyce, or there were huge figures in society that were the epitome of human brilliance. And now what we're seeing is the fact that because information is so accessible, it's allowing anyone to portray themselves as a conduit of knowledge, and then they want people to follow them, basically.
That's true. But I was reading this morning Kierkegaard, is that how you say it? Kierkegaard, something like that. I was reading his book, Fear and Trembling, and that was in 1940, right? As I was reading the notes, trying to find out when this was written, 1940, something like that. Maybe it was written before that, and that was another edition, I don't know. But he was already saying we're doomed then. Right? His opening line is, everybody's become an expert. No one gives a shit anymore. There's no idea of faith. There's no boundaries. Everyone's pushing the limits all over the place. He said that then, okay? And then Jung said that too at the time that he was writing. He said, we're in a crisis, you know, things are falling apart, things are going wrong, like we're living in levels of suffering that were not recognizable 50 years ago, escalations of extreme emergency. They were hitting the emergency button 100 years ago. They were hitting the emergency button hundreds of years before that too. Okay, so, but we've lost the thread so badly that we think we're at the beginning of the problem, right? And now, but that's not true. I think we're at the beginning of the market around the problem in a way that we never were before. So you're right, the firewall is gone. Anyone can be an author. I mean, I'm working on books right now where I do some books with people to assist them to write their books. I mean, most of the people who are the most organized are the people with the least amount of information.
Yes.
Okay, but they're repackaging all these, like, you know, 10 things you can do to sort yourself out, 10 things to make yourself rich, basically, or wealthy or comfortable or something, because they know that there's a market for it. So we have an insatiable desire to consume help, right? But it's not usually help for the soul, really. It's usually help for survival in the material realm, okay, but dressed up as soul. And this is the problem, right? So how do we separate the soul from the material situation? And I think that's maybe something important to do right now. So the soul is talking in symbolism. Okay, that's where we started. The soul talks symbolically. The soul belongs to an imaginarium, right, which is a whole intact sacred geometry of libidos, of imagery, of sensation, of guidance, of monsters that bring meaning, that try to communicate with the rational mind and the body to bring a gestalt, a whole sense of meaning to guide the life story. Now, that could be the personal life. For us, it would be seen that way. It's my personal life, right? But the indigenous view would be, no, it's the soul of the world that's communicating through the being. So that your dream in the indigenous sense is not about you. Your dream could be about the land that you're on, okay? That you are a conduit through who all the primary forces of the cosmos are trying to communicate to consciousness. And that the role of a human being would be to act as a bridge between the consciousness of the whole galaxy and the individual's ability to decipher it. Okay, so that your purpose as a human being was not to make yourself rich and comfortable and meaningful, but to bring wealth and harmony and meaning and constancy to the cosmos. That's important because we've lost the cosmos and we've got ourselves a narcissistic individual surrounded by screens and mirrors in a completely bouncing back hall of mirrors type imagery.
Yeah, echo chamber.
Yeah, echo chamber, and where we see ourselves reflected back all the time. And at the same time, we've got more information about soul work than we ever had available to us through the internet and through translation of the ancient texts, right? So then what seems to me to be happening, and this is all getting like quite rangy, isn't it? We're all over the place. But it seems like it's exactly the right kind of adventure for a magnificent redemption story, right? Because an adventure is when the most amount of chaos and the most amount of trouble erupts across the horizon and you don't know what's going on, you don't know how to fix it, but you do know that you have such an injury or there is such a threat that you've got to go on a quest.
Yeah, and it ends up being almost a rite of passage in a way.
Not almost, it is, right? And it has to be a crisis where you don't know how to fix it.
And the thing of, this is spoken of in The Hero's Journey with Joseph Campbell, and he talks about the fact that we have these things and there is a calling, but most people won't pick up the phone. So there's the calling and there's a turning away. Yes, and I think right now society is really fragmented and there's a part of people who are going towards the calling. And the thing is, the calling has probably happened multiple times in many people's lives, but they're just not picking up the phone.
True. Well, I mean, now it's more difficult, right? Because you don't know whether it's a legitimate caller. Okay, that's important, right? Because, yes, there's the invitation, right, which is cancer, divorce, misery, COVID, a crisis of faith in the world. A magician turns up at your door. You're just sitting there quietly and then there's a knock on the door. There's no particular problem, but you've been chosen to go on this this mission with other people who are dealing with a problem, right? It's not even your issue. Maybe that's what happened with me. You're joined in on this. Why? I don't know, because you've got the right kind of gift and the right kind of failures, right kind of failings, that you're going to be a necessary accessory. You might even be the most important accessory, not because you're so gifted, but because you're so screwed up, right? We need the right kind of crime, the right kind of criminal on this mission, okay? But then before you even go on the mission, you're writing a book about it. That's what's happening. Wait, I'm coming in the mission, but I need an image. Who am I? I'm going to invent an image for myself. Right? You've lost your contact now to the navigation system of the soul, which does not reflect in mirrors. The soul actually doesn't reflect in mirrors. The soul's to be found by looking into the well. Right? It comes bubbling up to you through the distorted layers of the water. When you look deep into the well, you see through the darkness, and then there's a pearl, or something glittery at the bottom of the well, and that's the soul, right? So you can't see it clearly, not until it's brought up, right? What's it brought up by? It's brought up by amphibious figures, like kind of creepy things that are like not undesirable, right? And that bring up the treasure of the soul. And so that's the journey. This is your shadow material, okay? So the journey is to go into the shadow material.
How do we know if the shadow is something that is part of the unconscious mind and something that is repressed and hidden? How do we know what is shadow and then what is
that's not
real?
what it is. And that's why, the shadow work that's being offered up, it's a bit dodgy, just like the yoga that's being offered up maybe is a bit dodgy. Some of it's well-intentioned, I think. But I think it's difficult to offer yoga really in the commercial space, because yoga is like dirty, right? It's meant to bring out the worst aspects of you. It's a laundry process in a way, right? It's meant to bring up your laundry. That's really difficult to do with 30 people going through an hour and a half, all dressed up in Lululemon, paying for it, right? And I saw it in Bali. There was a girl in Bali who probably was teaching yoga at a very well-established yoga school, and she ended up getting outed, and I think ended up in court, and ended up in being dragged through some pretty serious witch hunting, because her yoga was unpalatable for a yoga school. But probably what she was doing was actually yoga.
And this is what I felt when I've been in India studying with Indians, is the fact that it's painful also. We want these cushier experiences, or we want, how you said, the glamour of things, when the reality of a lot of these practices is, in the beginning, a lot of pain.
Yeah, a lot of pain, and a lot of dismembering, a lot of falling apart, a lot of having it go wrong, a lot of crisis.
And this fact of being, in a way, broken open.
Yeah, broken open. Yeah, and broken down, and the trials, there are set trials, the trial of disappointment, the trial of refusal, the trial of betrayal, the trial of starvation, the trial of ugliness, the trial of inadequacy, the trial of arrogance. All of these are trials that are quite predictable on this process, which is why, again, the indigenous, the people I was with in the Amazon didn't dress up fancy, because of you wouldn't dare to encourage those archetypes into you want to remain as unaffected as possible by these archetypes. Why? Because you value your harmonic relationship with the soul of the world higher than the rewards of the archetypal engagement. Right? So if you're very interested, for example, from an Aboriginal point of view, Australian Aboriginal point of view, listening to the song lines, right, the musical patterns of wisdom and meaning that come from walking country, there has to be less of you.
How they say walk upon the land lightly, is this what you're speaking of almost?
It's like we call it walkabout, or they would say walkabout. It means you're going on a pilgrimage. You're peeling yourself off. Right? Less of you. You don't know what you look like. You're not taking photos of yourself. There's not much of you here. Then you can become a conduit for, the song of the honey ant, the wisdom of the flowering wattle, the dreaming of the waterhole. This is more important than you. It is you, in a sense. But there's only way of getting you is to have less of you here so that you can become a conduit of something that's more magnificent and complex that becomes part of the family of you. So identity, maybe. Well, we're in a problem at the moment, right, with identity. So identity and self are not the same. Okay, so identity might be based on I like this and I don't like that. Right? I think that would be a good way to say it.
From a Jungian perspective, that would be more about what he says about the persona as an archetype. The persona that is taking about all the culture, and all the preferences are basically learned material.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the persona is like kind of like the bodysuit that you put on. Okay, so you put on a bodysuit and it's got a mask attached to it and it's got a set of etiquettes and it's got a place in society and it becomes like a trap, right? Let's say that he had to talk that way because this man is in Europe, right? He's a scientist, let's say. He's talking to the scientific community. He's surrounded by philosophers, and it's at the beginning of this idea that we don't want to have intuitive knowledge as a high status type of knowledge. We want provable, rational, testable, contestable information to run our society. So Jung was walking a very fine line. Right? He was talking to that part of the world, but that wasn't the world that he was living in. Right? He was studying Kundalini, he was studying the chakras, he was involved in esoterics, he was involved in a whole lot of stuff with Tony Wolff that was erotic. He was building the property. What was his property called? It'll come to me. But he was carving stones and moving stones around in the river. He was infantilizing himself at certain points to recover from a nervous breakdown that he was in the middle of having. So he wasn't free to speak, I think, what he actually felt a lot, right? Which is how we felt in the world up until recently. You had to be very careful. When I was a journalist working for women's magazines in the 90s, you couldn't talk about aromatherapy. It was too weird, right? It was considered witchy and kind of loopy, right? Now it's like everywhere, right? Why? Because it's commodified. So once the advertising industry got hold of it and they could sell it, then it was allowed to be spoken about. And this is what I'm talking about, materialism. Materialism, when it's ready to touch something and bring it to the culture, because it makes money, it becomes valid, right? And this is where we're in trouble. Right? So yoga makes money and now it's valid. Ayahuasca makes money and now it's valid. We've commodified these things, okay? So when we talk about the self, what I want to talk about is the soul. So, and the shadow, right? So let's say that the soul can only really become fully at home if it's absorbed the shadow, if the shadow is allowed to move, because the light that moves in the soul is thrown up by the contrasting darkness. Obviously, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the shadow is not the dark, scary material, right? It's not. The shadow is that which has not yet arisen, right?
It's where consciousness isn't able to put its full light on it yet, and that's why it remains in the dark in a way. And how they say the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow in a way.
Yeah, but it's also a natural physical consequence of being present. You know, because you're here, you throw a shadow.
Naturally, yeah.
Okay.
That it's just a phenomena happening
all
the time.
On one level it is that too. So if you're constantly trying to pull your shadow up into the light, you're kind of, it's an insanity, right? To say that when you walk down the street that you cast a shadow, but if you were highly, illuminated and highly conscious, you wouldn't cast the shadow. I mean, that's insane. Right? So the shadow has its place, and it's not meant to be mined completely, but it is the place where the language would be, that we use the shadow as a way to jettison that which we don't want to show the world through the persona. So it goes into the shadow, let's say, okay? It could be, that's a clumsy way to say it, but let's say that because I think it's useful at the moment in modern parley. I have a persona that can't accommodate my vengeance. It can't accommodate my jealousy. It can't accommodate my trauma. So that's in the shadow, right? That's how we say it. Okay, it's clumsy, but let's go with it. But what's also in your shadow is your good qualities that can't fit with your persona too. Okay, so your persona won't allow certain things about you that are beautiful, that are genius, because they don't fit with your persona. So they're also in the shadow. So the shadow's mixed. It has both amazing, beautiful, good things, Like, let's say for some women, what's in the shadow is motherhood. There's a whole topic there, right? For some women, what's in the shadow is self-love. Actual self-love is in the shadow, because they will not accommodate self-love that doesn't live in a body that looks a certain way, that doesn't live in a voice pitched a certain way, that isn't tantrified. So Tantra actually threw their best qualities of femininity into the shadow. That's potentially true. I would argue it is true. And then you could also say that ayahuasca and awakening through ordinary human goodness into the shadow for a huge number of people on the scene. And they're going to have to retrieve that, right? They're going to find out that they're going to have to retrieve it, because even though they're amazing, right, and they're awakened, they're lonely. Their friends don't support them. They don't have a matrix of people who love them really anyway. They can't be seen to fail. They have neuroses that are not at all allowed to be brought across the horizon in the community that they live in. They've been predated on by people who they thought were special, right? So, and also good judgment went into the shadow, right? They traded it for the adventure. Okay, so that's shadow. So when we're doing like, okay, somebody's doing a workshop here, let's balance the 4 archetypes, the 4 key archetypes of the shadow. And I'm just like, no, you're not going to be able to do that. The shadow is not, it will not answer to you. Okay? The shadow is not answering to you. You're nothing compared to the power of that material. That's why Jung would say, do not ever embody an archetype. We are not here to embody an archetype. You don't want to do that. An archetype is a dangerous thing to court. It's a primordial power. It's a maverick power. It's a inhuman power.
I was about to say, and the fact that it's not human.
It's not human. And so then that goes to this question that we're talking about now. The thing about a human, I mean, we don't know. People say that humans have soul and no one else.
Debatable.
Totally debatable. A really good debate. Unborn children don't have souls. That's why we can abort them. Cows don't have souls. That's why we can treat them the way we do. Chickens don't have souls. The trees don't have souls. That was a major break in the world story, when we got so wise and clever and cunning that we could argue that there was no soul in some places, right? There was no soul in black people. That's why we could slave them. There was no soul in women. That's why we could abuse them. There was no soul in ugly women. So we could abuse them in modern times in the playground, right? Not just in kind of patriarchal settings, right? We abuse each other all over the place because we have somehow forgotten or made a politic that helps us to get away with it. Now, we could never have developed the planet the way we did if we believed in a soul of the world. We couldn't have poisoned a river because it had a soul, right? We couldn't have cut down forests because they have soul. And then we have to work out, well, how much does soul really matter to us, actually? Because every time you're ordering from Lazada and renovating your kitchen and upgrading your interior decorating, you're chipping away at the soul of the world, because all of those materials are commodified products taken from material from the soul of the world, right? You don't get a kitchen unless you cut down a tree or mine or something. You see, and we've lost it. So, and you don't get soul, like I give up some of my soul if I try to present myself to you in certain ways. I throw it into the shadow. You see what I'm saying? And so this is where we've lost the plot.
So really what I'm hearing you say is that by compromising the soul of other people, by denying the soul of the world, by commodifying so much of the land that is really just an extension of the self, in a way we're pretending that we're not part of it all. And for me, when I look existentially outward, the greatest wound that we all have is the wound of separation, the myth of separation. And this is what creates loneliness and depression and spiritualized poverty. And the saddest part is that this grief, this injury, this atrophy of the soul, we've participated in. So I think a lot of the question, especially when we talk about soul and even love, especially love, is what are you willing to sacrifice for what you love? And a byproduct of love is this natural arising of care. If we love the earth, we only take what we need. If we see the river as ourselves, we cannot contaminate it, for it would be contaminating our own body. If we love the trees, we can't chop them down because we know it's a part of our lungs and how we breathe, and it's us. A lot of the time too, the body, the soul communicates through the body. And because we're given our incarnations and this body, there are specific demands from each unique individual. So for me, I'm small brown woman. I'm not going to go fight wars. It's not part of my soul's quest, but a lot of it is what presses on me the most. And a lot of it will have to do with this specific incarnation, this body, this history I've been given. And that's beyond persona. That's beyond preferences. What is the adventure? What is the soul's journey that this body is a part of, and allowing the mind to follow rather than the mind being in intellectual separation, pretending it's not a part of the whole. My soul knows it is. So there's this soul level contract that's been echoing around most of us that has most likely been pushed into the shadow, and it will haunt you. It will turn into a strange complex. It will turn into addiction. It will turn into anxiety because it's ghosting around waiting for you to take it on. And most of us are so overstimulated, so distracted that we don't even know what the soul's journey is. And so you talked about to heal, going into the Amazon, going into nature, going into the forest, being around a lack actually of stimulation. So much of the way the soul speaks is in whispers. And it's so easy to tune out when you're in the modernized world that's just trying to pull at your consciousness. So to end this conversation, I would say to myself and to listeners to get quiet inside. And a lot of the time we talked about the shadow too. The soul's journey will be from the greatest wound. What is the largest inner conflict, inner contradiction in yourself that has not been played out? Exhaust it, go into it, and commit yourself to looking at that wound. And on a larger level, knowing that this personal wound has a universal message. So, yeah, I want to thank you guys for tuning in today, and Jade for being here, and yeah, for us to all allow ourselves to have a dialogue with this part of ourselves.